Hi, everybody, and welcome to the February edition of CGY Conversations with. This month, we're talking to Brett Lashua, who joined UCL IOE last year, just after the first lockdown was imposed in the UK, which was, I guess, rather unfortunate timing. Sorry, Brett. Brett takes an interdisciplinary approach to research, and his research kind of spans youth leisure, cultural sociology, popular culture, and media studies. And this means he has looked at topics as diverse as hip-hop performances in public spaces, community-based youth centres, cultural heritage music, and myth-making. And this also means, Brett, that based on your publication list, you get to have some of the best titles on your publications. I think that's much more fun than the rest of us get to have.
Thanks. I'm trying. We need to have a little bit of rock and roll in our lives, I think.
Indeed, especially at the moment. Although, as I have a young child, most of my life is not rock and roll. It's more the Wiggles and Moana and Disney. And I have to say, I miss music, real music.
It's coming, and there's never a bad time to start the education early. Introduce all the classics.
Well, this is completely relevant, but I never got any of the Disney classics, so I'm finally learning them as an old person. So I guess it's me finally gaining the childhood popular culture that I never got.
Well, I mean, the rock classics. You could start listening to all the education stuff, the foundations that everybody should have at some point in their life, I think.
That's true. Guns N' Roses.
We can have debates about that for sure.
Yeah. Anyway, so thank you very much for joining us today. It's wonderful to see you. It's
My
wonderful
pleasure.
to see humans. I want to start off by asking you just to tell us a little bit about your research with young people.
Well, I've been working with young people for since my master's program, actually, in the late 90s. And my undergraduate degree was in history, but I was a musician. I was a practicing musician at the time. And when I realized there wasn't a future for me as a rock star or a historian, I did a master's program that was based around youth recreation programs. And that's when I first really became interested in questions of youth and youth cultures and youth practices. I mean, this was a recreation program that was delivering things were supposedly or seen as being good or beneficial and not particularly challenged in lots of ways. So that was an eye-opening experience for me. I worked in a recreation program that served or worked with adopted young people with disabilities and sibling groups particularly, and mixed race or cross-race adoption placements. So it was a really great organization. It was a really interesting program, but it left me with a lot of questions. And the most important thing was it wasn't engaged with music. So when I went to do my PhD program in the early 2000s, I was able to bring my interest in youth recreation programs and youth leisure together with youth music and questions of music making. And I was also interested in place. As you kind of rattled through some of the areas of interest that I've explored earlier, I became very interested in the politics of youth spaces and places. I was working in Western Canada, in Edmonton, in my PhD program. So those were sort of the core foci at first. It was youth leisure, youth music making, and youth places, and then all sorts of other ideas became part of that mix. My research was in a school, so I became interested in alternative schools. It was a really creative, alternative, cooperative charter school, and it was based in a social services unit and sort of in the basement of the social services unit in Edmonton. And most of the students who self-enrolled at the school were First Nations, or Aboriginal Canadian, Indigenous young people. So that brought a really different inflection to the kinds of music that we were making. So I became interested in the politics of race, racialization. I wasn't interested in hip hop music particularly in most of my music making career, but that's where it was at with the group of young people I was working with at the time. So I became interested in the politics of hip hop, rap music, but more hip hop culture more broadly in terms of breakdancing and graffiti culture and street knowledge. And then after I finished my PhD, even though it was in a leisure kind of context, I came to the UK and I worked in social sciences at Cardiff University, doing some work with young people in exploring their biographies through walking tours, walking tour interviews, trying to dig through the relationships between changing lives, young people growing up and growing older, and changing places in the South Wales valleys. So much more attuned to changing places at that point. And then I had a gig at the University of Liverpool, which has been probably one of the most important sort of career shaping experiences that I've had, where I worked with Sarah Cohen at the Institute for Popular Music Studies there, and a big ethnographic 2-year postdoc that I was part of that was mapping music and music heritage in the city. And so that became a really central focus as well in terms of bringing heritage into the mix, the kinds of questions that we could ask about the uses of the past. And I was able to draw on some of my interests in history and explore all the different layers of heritage and music making in the city. And that was in Liverpool, which of course is a great music city, where it has elements that make it a great music city. It had lots of elements that were invisible or erased or forgotten about. So yeah, lots of intersecting. I like thinking of my work as interdisciplinary. I know that kind of gets tossed around. It almost becomes meaningless. It's a word that's often used and not often really operationalized, I suppose. But for me, it's about young people, leisure experiences of urban spaces, and social inequalities, largely to do with race, but then the way that race or racializations intersect with other kinds of exclusion, poverty, all the things that come through really vividly in hip hop, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. So you bring together history and sociology within your work then?
Yeah, I think it's history has to underpin everything to a certain extent. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but partly history, but with social science methods, with sociology methods.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm reluctant to call myself an ethnographer anymore because I've not done ethnographic field work in a few years. But I say that would have been my home. Anymore, I do more archival research or just qualitative interviewing. I was involved with a recent project that did digital storytelling workshops with young people, and that was really fantastic because the young people produced some extraordinary content, just great digital stories. But yeah, I don't like to put all my eggs in one basket, and I think that's the joy of being interdisciplinary. Just saying.
Well, it's also one of the joys of being an academic. I think we get to choose and we get to wander off. It's maybe not always in our best interests, career building wise, but
wandering is bored. Yeah, wandering is great. I mean, I think that's the point for me. Is I don't know things, and I want to know. It's that curiosity, that wanting to know, that leads me into these different terrains. I didn't know anything about First Nations young people. I didn't know anything about hip hop. Mm-hmm. Certainly didn't know anything about the South Wales valleys or Liverpool. And it's always great to have guides, I suppose. And that's the point of the research for me, is that it's not necessarily me driving forward with those kinds of questions. It's about the position and the interest that the young people that I work with have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If I can take you back to the Indigenous communities that you worked with and the young people there and the hip hop that they were doing, what do you think their music making told us about their lives in society?
A hell of a lot. And it wasn't, I mean, this was a part of when you asked you sent me the questions and said, what does pop music tell us about youth and society? We can read pop music, of course, but it's also, I mean, I think in like the Stuart Hall sense of representation, it's more than just a telling. It's where that becomes real. It's the music is where the articulation of the social relations takes place. It's what makes it concrete, I suppose. It's not just a reflection of what's going on in their lives. It's where what's going on in their lives becomes real, tangible. And in Western Canada, at least at the time, in the early 2000s, there was a lot of young Indigenous people who were moving from rural reserves in Alberta. And I think you could say this across Western Canada, but probably across Canada in general, and maybe even more of a global phenomenon of moving into cities. And so there was also a shift then in terms of how to represent or understand that urban experience. And in Canada, the main form of popular music that was part of those Indigenous youth communities, I'm told, was heavy metal in the 90s, and also country music. And this kind of reflected rurality of young people's experiences of living on reserves in outside of the city centers. And as more young people moved into city centers, they became more interested in hip hop music. And then there was also an identification with African-American culture and the politics of poverty and racism in the States. There was a real strong identification with young people were saying, I can relate to racism, being the gaze of the other, they're being subjected to this gaze of othering, certainly poverty, and all those sorts of issues that are kind of common tropes, I suppose, in American rap or hip hop. And the young people that I worked with in particular, they'd struggled in their education. So many of them they had gaps in their learning, is the way that the school described it. They'd failed or they'd been expelled from every other school in the city, and then they could self-enroll and come back into this particular education center, Boyle Street Education Center. And so they were dismissed in lots of ways as not intelligent, not educated. All the stereotypes about dangerous youth were at play, particularly then layered over with racist stereotypes about young primitive natives, uncivilized, savage kinds of things. And this is in Alberta, which is cowboy country. It's the Texas of Canada. Huge problems with racism. Lots and lots of white guys walking around with cowboy hats on, saying, you're a fucking Indian, get out of my way, really, really overt racism. And so the students I was working with had struggled in all sorts of ways. And then they were also often labeled as having learning difficulties because they didn't do well in school. So there was layers of, being labeled as ADHD or having fetal alcohol spectral disorder, FASD. So they were either fast or slow or any other sorts of labels you could strap onto them. And what I found in the music making project that I did, which was not a traditional music making project, it wasn't about sitting down with guitars and drums and those sorts of things. There was no time for that. And of course, those young people had never been exposed to traditional instruments and they're too hard to learn. What we did was digital music production, electronic music making on a computer where you can sit down, open up some beats, open up some samples, slap them all together, plug a microphone in and record a verse. And that's what most of the young people I worked with were interested in, recording lyrics or making remixes that they could breakdance to. And for all of the labels and all of the pejorative racist bullshit that was stacked against most of the young people, they were amazingly creative and supremely intelligent about what they wanted to say about their lives, and the lyrics were just unbelievable. I'll never forget one of the young men I worked with who was labeled ADHD and FASD at the same time. He sang a song about the flocks of life's lost clients want to relieve the long overdrawn silence instead of resorting to violence because that's just a minus. And it's like these really powerful lyrics. His one verse started off, there's a problem of an issue that we as natives can't wipe away with tissue, an eternal wound and an itch too. There isn't a doctor to stitch you. And it's like such a powerful metaphor of this sort of scar, the scar of colonialism that never closes, that you can read about that in the academic literature. And here it was present in a young person's lyrics. Beautiful, powerful, the poetic element of the politics of representation in that young person's music was it was razor sharp. The young people had a huge amount to say about what they saw as real discrimination, real violence, real hatred that they were exposed to, and then a politics of hope with that at the same time. These are the ways we want to move forward as First Nations people. These are the way we want to move forward as friends, as allies, as parents, those sorts of things.
So what you're seeing, because for some people they'd say, oh, that's just copying the United States and American hip hop. But what you're saying instead is that was a lot more agentic than that, and it gave them a voice and they remade those tropes to fit their own lives.
Yeah, they had a lot to say about the specific issues related to colonization and settler colonialism in Canada. They had very strong views on what they needed to do um, to make changes. But the danger of that, of course, is then young people there are seen as both the problem and the solution to the problems that are going on. And so it was the need for, I mean, the great thing is that the school was very active in, because it was part of a bigger social services unit in the city. And then we also had really close ties with the city council. And some of the best scenes of that project was, because we wanted the young people to be involved in civic events in the city, ways to transform public spaces. We would take student groups to city council. We'd have to pitch projects and ideas to them. And in one of them, the students jumped up on the table and were rapping and doing a performance at the city councilors in order to get approval that we could then participate in a national celebration or a big event in the city. But they were really overt and really proud of what they had to say. So
I'm also thinking that's a really good, what we would call now for Ref, an impact story. The students were able to bring their voices to the council.
Yeah, and, for their part, the council was pretty amenable to some things. There's still an event that's going on. I mean, my field work, my project there was 2001 to 2005, so quite a long time ago now. But a couple of the students who were more active in the city's hip hop scene, a couple of them, they took over the project after I left, so there was a bit of a legacy there. But then also they started a cipher, a gathering, a hip hop gathering on the city's main square, Churchill Square, which might need to be renamed, by the way. Churchill Square in central Edmonton, they have a weekly cipher, a big sort of get together during the summer where they have an open mic and turntables and breakdancing. And it's a celebration of youth hip hop culture right in the center of the city, and it's supported by the council. So those are some things I suppose we could see as victories.
Yeah. When you shifted your lens over to the UK and in Liverpool, I'm getting a sense there was a bit more of a historical element to it as well. So how does the youth leisure experience and music experience in Britain differ?
The project in Liverpool was, still have projects on the go or in the mix in Liverpool. So that was initially the 2007 to 2009 was part of its celebrations for being European Capital of Culture. And that project had two overlapping elements. One was archival and historical, and looking at maps, and it was about the characterization of different areas of the city and through music and memory. And the other element of it was ethnographic and working with musicians and doing some contemporary mapping of the city. And then there was not a huge, but for me it felt huge, a significant number of follow-on projects that I've been able to do to carry on some of that work. In Liverpool, it was really interesting because of course I was engaging with a popular music or popular culture that is very much part of social or collective memory. I knew a lot about the city before I'd even ever been there. And the first time I went to meet Sarah Cohen, she said, when you get to Calderstone School, that's the school that the Beatles went to. That was the Quarrybank School. Then hang a left, and then come up this way. And I was like, of course I know the Quarrybank School, and you know all the places in the city because of the way they circulate in popular texts. So it was interesting to engage with Beatles heritage and Beatles story and see that as part of the contemporary heritage and tourism industries in the city. And then also engage with other layers like post-punk and the histories of post-punk and all these subcultures that I kind of knew about through my own musical experience when I was younger, like Britpop and then later iterations like electronic dance music and rave culture, acid house, and all that sort of stuff, and try to map all those layers onto the city. It was a great project, and Liverpool was a lot of fun. I know it's there's Liverpool exceptionalism on one hand, and it's not characteristic of lots of other cities, but there are resonances and there's similarities in some ways. Not sure that answered the question. I'm trying to remember what the original question was. How did it change my understanding of music scenes, music cultures?
No, I'm just wondering about how youth in Liverpool, or
Mm.
that particular with its long, that's more, I guess Liverpool is an example that you've sort of testified to there, where it is much more, music is much more accepted. So did you find young people's engagement with those scenes?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's an honorary. You can't move to Liverpool without picking up an instrument and playing an instrument of some sort. It's a badge of belonging that you walk around with a guitar strapped on your back, which is bad for me because I'm a drummer. But the joy of the city was I hadn't played drums in about 7 or 8 years, but I just couldn't stop myself when I was there. And of course, I was in a music department and I had access to recording studios and other things. But as part of my ethnographic field work, and I mean, my vision of that is it's not just participant observation. It's much more direct participation where I can either work in recording studios with young people, or a walking tour interview is a good example where the power dynamic is different, where you're walking side by side with somebody, or I could play in a band and join a scene and actually participate in the scene. So I joined lots of bands when I was there as part of the ethnographic research. I played with a post-hardcore rock band, a folk singer, so a very political folk singer, an indie rock singer, young woman who was a singer-songwriter, and the main project I got involved with was a hip hop act, a sort of R&B hip hop artist named Kof, K-O-F. And I did a bunch of youth festivals performances with Kof, and actually played Glastonbury in 2009 with Kof. So I got involved in all those things. And what was quite interesting is those scenes, I was the only linchpin between them. So they didn't mix. There was a real, obviously in Liverpool, because of its heritage with the Beatles and post-punk, there's a real guitar heavy rock or indie rock kind of vibe there. And there was very little place for hip hop or R&B or urban music, I guess, as we might call it, in the city. So that was very interesting to map, and really quite insightful to be part of that.
But not only that, you also basically skipped across different subcultures.
Yep.
So what would you say are the similarities and differences that you encountered by basically dipping into 4 or 5? Did you have to change your hair each time? I presume you had to change how you dressed.
Yeah, the habitus was radically different for each one. No, it wasn't too bad, largely because as a drummer, I was a little bit less present, and I was just kind of participating as a hired hand. I was only in the city for 2 years. But my experience, it changes radically. So for one, I used a sort of a different drum set, entirely electronic drums. And for one, it was a stripped down kit, and tried to change my playing to try to.
You're answering that question as a musician.
Yeah,
not a sociologist.
trying to tap into those different forms of habitus. Yeah. So I didn't change my clothes too much, but it definitely was radically different. The language, of course, changed a lot. One of the great jokes was when I was working with all the hip hop musicians, we'd have these studio sessions, and all the young people would be talking, and I would turn to my key partner, my contact with a youth he's a fantastic colleague named Yao Owusu, and Yao ran a youth media and culture nonprofit company called Urbeats. And Yao and I just used to laugh hysterically because all the young people would be speaking not only in a British accent, which was difficult for me at first, but it was a Scouse British accent, and then it was hip hop inflected on top of that. So there was sort of 3 layers of meaning that I had to try to dig through. And I was always about 2 or 3 seconds behind in the conversation, and some stuff I just had to turn and say, I need a translation on that. There was a definite vernacular for the youth hip hop culture and scene in the city, which is great. And I fit a little bit better into the indie scene because that's kind of where what I'd come out of, sort of very casual ripped jeans and a concert t-shirt. And it was easy for me to flip back to that because I'd been part of an indie scene in the 1990s, sort of my main moment in the American rock scene, indie rock scene. The folk scene was an education for me because it was about drawing on a very particular history of Liverpool around its docks and its dock workers, and a real sense of working classness that I was not familiar with. So that was an incredible education. And then there was also links to football culture there because the one artist that I worked with. His name's Alan Perry, and Alan Perry is a huge Liverpool football club fan, but was caught up in the middle of the controversy over ownership and ticket prices, and he'd been one of the people who'd set up an alternative Liverpool football club, a fan-owned and fan-initiated football club. So I got in, all of that came into it, the casuals and away days and all that sort of football culture and laddishness came into it. Again, another history that I wasn't familiar with. It was really interesting to learn more about. So yes, there are sociological facets to all of those different groups and associations. And of course, then histories of music that I wasn't particularly familiar with as well. The history of hip hop and grime and urban music in the UK, very different to what I was familiar with. And so it was just great. That's the thing about being a sociological researcher or an ethnographer, is just listening. I think that's the most important skill. I mean, Les Back would talk about this. It's just the art of listening and being able to.
But also your outsider status, and sort of particularly as a drummer outsider, giving you an extra layer, means that you had permission to really ask, what do you mean by that? I don't understand. Can you translate that for me?
Yeah.
So it must have been amazing.
It was a great research experience for me. I'm hugely grateful for it. And it made me think about, there was lots of affordances in terms of, I did have some knowledge of musical subcultures and musical worlds that I could tap into, and lots of things I needed to know for sure. Yeah. It made me really aware of the layers, the depths of knowledge, the depths of understanding in any one of those particular scenes. Yeah.
And being able to compare and contrast must have just become second nature and given you such a new lens that if you'd gone into just one particular subculture, you can't see it in the same way if you can see it in the round by comparing it to others and have different pockets to compare it to.
Yeah, and part of it was, I'd read a lot of the youth subcultures literature as a master's student in the US, and then as a PhD student in Canada. And so actually coming to the UK and sort of seeing a lot of it just sort of made sense to me all of a sudden, because I could see things about Manchester and its relationship with Liverpool and the ways that working class cultures had been written about in some of that literature that I just really couldn't relate to when I was in North America. Didn't have the same resonance or carry the same kinds of representational meaning. So it showed it to me, on the ground, I guess, and that's sort of the part of the joy of ethnographic work as well.
It also emphasizes the importance of place, though, having to actually experience the place in order to fully understand.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of wondering how you think your research can take place in the current pandemic. So what impact do you think COVID-19 pandemic is going to have on youth leisure, youth subcultures?
Yeah, for me, it's because I like to work side by side with participants. It's been meant that I've not proceeded with a number of projects that I had in planning. And one was a music making project to look at the rearticulation of a Black British or African Caribbean Britishness through popular music. And the project was going to be based in Liverpool, Leeds, Birmingham, and London with some project partners, and to invite young people to make songs about what it means to be British in a post-Windrush scandal kind of environment. How if identity is a suture, a stitching together, what happens when that suture has been reopened as a kind of a wound, I guess. So we've put that on hold. The bigger questions. I also have an archival project where I'm trying to engage with a personal collection of a fantastic music industry, sort of an all-rounder named Mark Rye, who passed away a couple of years ago, but in his retirement, he'd recorded interviews with people. I mean, he kind of realized that people were dying, that he wanted to know what their stories were. So he rushed out and interviewed hundreds of colleagues that he'd been involved with working in the 1960s and 1970s. And he created this fantastic archive. And then unfortunately, Mark also passed away about 5-6 years ago. And his archive is just sitting. And so it's an incredible resource of the British popular music industry that I hope to be able to do some work with it and try to find a home for it is, I think, the more important part, so it could be shared. But I haven't been able to continue on with those. Partly it's I haven't been able to travel, and partly I can't meet up with people. And partly it's just because I've been immersed in my teaching in my first year at UCL. The bigger context of coronavirus has been pretty much the decimation of the live music industry in the UK. And we haven't mentioned it, but before I came to UCL, I taught at Leeds Beckett University, and I taught in part in the arts and music faculty. And one of the courses that I taught on was called entertainment management. And most of those students then moved into working in live music and live events in terms of their careers. And I'm still friends and in contact with a lot of them through like Facebook pages and those kinds of social media sites. But they've all really had a hard time. And just the idea that, there's, for musicians, for people working in the live music, live entertainment industries, there's no venues open, there are no clubs, there are no music festivals, and there's been no support for those sectors either. So the impact on youth leisure and youth music, youth scenes, it's been absolutely tremendous, and it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. There's been a lot that's been done online. I've seen some really wonderful concerts on Facebook, and there's some great, really creative ways that musicians have tried to collaborate on Zoom and other kind of events, or some live DJ sets have been really fabulous ways to get people to come together and share things. But the risk of the shortfall is that the limitations of life online is, I think I mentioned this before we started recording, is we feel distanced and we only connect online. And then the answer to that is that isolation is try to have more events online. So it only sort of reproduces the alienation. So I think people are, especially in terms of youth music events and live music making, are desperate to get back out. And that's why we're seeing lots of underground rave events. And this is, again, another thing that I really couldn't understand, that I didn't have a sense of the way that the acid house or early rave scenes had developed in the UK in the 80s. And you can almost see like a flavor of it, where people are saying, we need to get together and have this event in this disused space. So it's interesting to see those kinds of risky events that are happening again, because people are desperate to get together. And it's dangerous to predict the future, but I am slightly interested in future studies and thinking of using the past to imagine possible futures. And there's a lot of conjecture at the moment that when this pandemic dissipates and hopefully the vaccination works, we're going to re-enter an era that's going to be like the jazz age again. Not the roaring 20s where people are a bit more hedonistic. And I really wonder if that's going to be the case with particularly with youth cultures, and really embracing live in the moment, go to every music festival possible, and really enjoy yourself to excess.
Yeah,
Curious.
so that was my feeling, but I'd just like to be contrary. Honestly, it's my worst flaw. Yeah. But when you say that, I'm kind of thinking, but hold on, haven't we been told for the past 10 years that young people have been retreating to their bedrooms? They are less likely to engage in risky behavior. Now we've just had a massive risk posed to their lives. Why do we assume it's probably much more likely to be older millennials and younger Gen X that go out and rush back to Glastonbury and do all of those things? Maybe young people they're just so used to being in their bedroom now, that's where they'll stay. I think that's another risk. It
is, yeah. There's that polarization, that split, absolutely, yeah.
I'm also kind of curious because I'm teaching about subcultures this week, and I used to up until last year, part of it was as a newspaper article saying, where have all the subcultures gone? There's, young people, there's no subcultures anymore. And then TikTok transforms that now. And we just have subcultures everywhere. It's quite amazing. So I've been, doing a deep dive on dark academia, cottagecore. I am not quite sure why cottagecore reflects a subculture. I mean, it seems to just involve wearing long dresses, but I'm not part of that culture, so that's why I don't understand it.
Yeah.
So I think there's a way in which, to me, it seems like, as an outsider, that it could be accelerating certain sorts of subcultures or allowing people to dip in and out of those and try them on.
Yeah, it's a flourishing of all these various niche, lifestyles or post subcultures, neo tribes. All those kinds of concepts come into play, don't they? For me, it's kind of like chasing a little ball of mercury around on a tabletop, and the more you try to put your finger on it, the more it splits and goes somewhere else. Because I had the same sense of, look at all these really interesting things that are happening on TikTok. But then when I speak with my daughter who's 15, or when I talk to my undergraduate students who a little bit older, but not that much older, they say, oh no, TikTok is for younger. Those are for preteens. So we don't do TikTok. That's a younger demographic. And it just goes to show it's the more you think it's here, it's actually somewhere else.
Now, my favorite tip from a gossip blog that I write is that if you know about it, you're too old and the young people have left. They have moved on.
Exactly.
So I've been trying to. So my 13-year-old niece tells me Snapchat is back where it's at. So that's where we should be doing. And you can also see there's way too many parents showing up on TikTok doing dances in the kitchen. So clearly it's gotten too safe.
Yeah, well, it's part of that whole. The big trope for me was the older gentleman who was riding the skateboard, drinking the cranberry juice, listening to Fleetwood Mac. And you think when Fleetwood Mac comes back around, then things have chilled out a little bit too much. But yeah, you're right. I always got to listen to what the young people are listening to and not what I think is important. That's for sure.
Well, for me, it's more, okay, if you're not there, where are you, so that I can go and study you, because I need to figure out how you are reshaping culture and your lives. And that's where I'm thinking. So you said you were kind of interested in future studies. What does the future hold for us? What should we be researching next? What are the urgent things we need to be doing?
Those are always the 64,000-pound questions, aren't they? My interests have turned towards heritage, and that's partly because I'm older, I guess. My last project was I had a little fellowship where I got to go to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which is in my hometown in Cleveland, Ohio, in the States. And I got to spend time in their archives and explore my question, which was, why is the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland in the first place? And that allowed me to have really fun, fanciful titles like the Moondog, the Buzzard, and the Battle for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But my interest in heritage grows out of the uses of the past, and the way that's Laura Jane Smith's phrase or title of her book, The Uses of the Past, and the ways that heritage is important to what we do now, what kind of sense and meaning making we do in the present. And the projects that I'm interested in are continuing to work or engage or struggle with questions of racializations and racisms. And, it's almost a cliche, or it's sort of a bit of a buzzword to talk about social justice. And, in the wake of, the tremendous social movement of Black Lives Matter and the protests that took place last year, to talk about decolonizing the curriculum and questions of how do we address the huge problems of race and racism that exist around the world. There's been some scholars who've been dealing with those questions for a long time, and I always go back to some of that work. But the project in Liverpool that is most on my mind at the moment was a documentary film that I was part of. It was one of the follow-on projects after I'd done the postdoc there. And the documentary film was looking at mapping a number of social clubs, diasporic social clubs, community centers, that were in the city in its traditional Black British neighborhoods, the Toxteth neighborhood, or used to be called Liverpool 8 or Granby. Toxteth was a name that was dumped on that neighborhood after the unrest there in 1981. It was rebranded by the media as a sort of deviant, derelict, forbidden, forsaken place, whereas before that it was seen as a real thriving hub of Liverpool's Black communities. So I did a documentary film there that invited young people to interview older residents and sort of an intergenerational exchange. And the impetus for that was I'd seen a map that was drawn by a community leader, an elder, who had drawn this really rich map that had all these clubs on it, the Yoruba Club and the Somali Club and the Federal Club and then the Igbo Club and the Caribbean Center. And there were the two streets in Liverpool, Upper Parliament Street and Catherine Street, I guess, or Prince's Avenue, Prince's Road, Upper Parliament Street and Prince's Avenue. And there was dozens of social clubs on those streets. And then I had a hip hop artist draw a map for me during interviews, and same two streets and nothing, no venues at all, no clubs, no sense of what was there or what had been there before. So the point of the project was to get young people to interview older residents and sort of uncover or rediscover the heritage of that neighborhood through the story of its social clubs, these older venues that had all been erased or disappeared since the 1980s, really. And it's those kind of projects that's become really important to me in terms of neighborhood mappings, local studies, engaging with the relationships that young people have with place, trying to create wider intergenerational conversations about social injustices and histories of racism and poverty and exclusion. I'm far more interested, and this makes me worry about the funding picture and sort of lots of the big projects that I see going on are these really immense, trying to come up with, society-wide solutions to things. And my brain just doesn't work like that. I want to get into these two streets in Liverpool and how that connects with the 10 young people that I interviewed and the 15 older residents that we interviewed, and how those two groups talk to each other about the history of their neighborhood. That becomes far more important and way more interesting to me in terms of what we do next. I was involved in a project that I think I mentioned. I did some digital storytelling research in Southern Ontario with some Canadian colleagues. This was about 4 or 5 years ago now, but we're still writing from some of the field work that we did there. And that was looking at two different neighborhoods as well. One was a housing estate that was traditionally white working class, and the other was a housing estate that was traditionally newcomer or migrants, recent newcomers or migrants to Canada, predominantly from areas like Ethiopia and Somalia, Eritrea, and that kind of the Horn of Africa region, and also Afghanistan and other refugees. So really different neighborhoods, very small scale geographies. And then we invited those young people to make digital stories that told part of their biography in relationship to the place and in terms of their neighborhood. And then we tried to bring those groups together and have them talk about what was going on in their region of Southern Ontario. And that kind of research, I just find it makes my heart sing, and it's where I want to be. Incredible stories. It's in that case, we can draw the histories of globalization and migration and movement and the history of Canada together, and these big swirls, these big sweeps of social change together, and then they come down into a 5-minute personal digital story that sort of allows us entree into all those other big questions. And so I guess that brings me back to where we started. It's like, what can pop music tell us about young people and society? And I think that's for me, the answer. The answer is it tells us something about change. And that's what I'm kind of interested in. It's very much what I'm interested in, change or the lack of change as it may be. But if we can read and understand change in one digital story, one little 5-minute composition or one song, because it allows us or links into all these other issues. And I think that's what's really exciting about the research that I've done and the research that I hope to do.
Thank you so much, Brett. Your passion is very clear, and it's also very inspiring. I'll come back to you at another time to talk to you about some of the methods that you used, because I will be stealing some of your ideas. Thank you very much.
Anytime. It's been a pleasure. I'm sorry I rambled so much. And if anybody's watching this and has any questions, feel free to drop me an email and say, in that video, how could you possibly say that? Could you defend that? And no, actually, if anybody has any questions about anything I've mentioned, I'd welcome an email and further conversations. Yeah, and of course, further conversations with you, Ava.
Wonderful. Well, I look forward to those. Let's keep each other company while we're stuck in our rooms. I'm going to turn off the recording now. So thank you so much for your time. Okay.
Cheers.